Now, this is the second video for week 8. I want to expand on incontinence and talk some more about that. One of the things that Aristotle discusses, and he really thinks it's a key puzzle that he needs to work out here, is this question of, well, if the incontinent person knows what's right, and in one sense kind of wants to do that, well, why the heck does he act so contrary to what he knows he should do? So Aristotle starts wondering, well, does the person even actually have knowledge? Is it just that he has some sort of like opinion about things, but he doesn't really know what he should do? Because if he knew what he should do, well, he would carry out that knowledge. In this regard, Aristotle is addressing what sometimes is called ethical determinism. And it's also a view that Aristotle's teacher Plato seemed to follow. At least Plato and Socrates seem to accept this view, namely that really ethics is about knowing what's good, and the knowledge will become so powerful in you that will just lead you almost automatically to do what's right. So the key issue at play for Plato and Socrates was knowing the good. Knowing the good was commensurate in some sense for them with doing the good. Now, what Aristotle says is, look, this doesn't seem quite adequate. There's lots of people that seem to know what's good, but not always apply that knowledge or habitually fail to apply that knowledge. So it's not just an occasional thing, but it's more of a habit or way of life where they fail to carry out and put into practice what they know to be good, what they know they should do. They end up doing what they know they should not do. So the people are in a weird situation. They have the knowledge, they're not putting it into practice. Now, what Aristotle ends up saying, I kind of hinted at this last time, what he ends up saying, in other words, to kind of resolve this issue, is that the person's reasoning is at work, but it gets unduly influenced by the appetitive faculty or the person's emotions. The person's emotions, in other words, take on too powerful a role in the reasoning faculty's work and directing of the soul. Let me break it down even more clearly. What Aristotle talks about is that the person who is incontinent follows what Aristotle calls a practical syllogism. Now, this term can be confusing, but it doesn't have to be. A syllogism, in essence, is just a logical form. It's a way of reasoning logically about things. An example of a syllogism is the following. All men are, first premise, all men are mortal. Second premise, Socrates is a man. Conclusion, therefore, Socrates is mortal. Okay, the famous Barbara syllogism. Now, Aristotle, in other works, talks a lot about such syllogisms. This is what's called syllogistic logic, this form of arguing that all A are B, or no A are B, or some A are B, etc. Now, for our point of view, we're just looking at what kind of syllogisms and reasoning is involved in our actions, and more specifically, what kind of syllogisms or reasoning is involved in our actions when we act in an incontinent manner. How are our minds working when we act against what we know we should do. So it's kind of a paradox. Our minds are at work in a way that leads us to act against what we know we should do. So let's see what Aristotle says about that. Well, what Aristotle says about this is that when we're acting in these cases, we're carrying out what he calls what I said before, a practical syllogism. Now, a practical syllogism, unlike a regular syllogism, like the one I mentioned that all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, and therefore Socrates is mortal, a practical syllogism has as its conclusion not just an idea or a statement, it has as its conclusion an action. So when you reach the end or the conclusion of a practical syllogism, it's not that you're sitting there and you come to a new idea or a clearer understanding. When you've reached the end of a practical syllogism, you're doing something. It terminates in our activity in the world. It leads us to act in a certain way. Now, what Aristotle further says is that the practical syllogism, just like the syllogism I mentioned earlier, follows the following format. Now, the syllogism I mentioned earlier had a universal or general premise as number one. All men are mortal. Okay? The second premise was our particular, specific premise, which was Socrates is a man. And the conclusion was, therefore, Socrates is mortal. Now, the practical syllogism also has as its first premise a universal or general premise. The practical syllogism has as its second premise a more specific or particular premise, and has as its conclusion not an idea or a statement, but an action. So let's give an example. Practical syllogism could say something like premise one, fatty foods are unhealthy. General statement. Premise two, this large bowl of French fries is fatty. Now, excuse me. Actually, you know what? Let me back this up for a second. The practical syllogism example. First of all, premise one, fatty foods are unhealthy and should be avoided. Premise two, the specific, more particular premise. This bowl of French fries is fatty. Okay? Now, the practical syllogism has a conclusion. Again, that's not an idea or a statement, but an action. So what would be the conclusion of this? The conclusion would be avoid the unhealthy, fatty French fry bowl or bowl of French fries. So you have your reasoning at work leading you from a universal idea to the specific case. And based on that reasoning, you follow out or you conclude with an action that's in concert with what you've just reasoned. The action flows from it. It follows directly from it, just like in the first syllogism I mentioned, the conclusion that Socrates is mortal follows necessarily from the premises. It just flows out from the premises. Same thing is at work here, except the conclusion is an action and not a statement. Okay. Now that seems hopefully fairly obvious in this case. You have these practical syllogisms at work, they follow the format of the universal premise, the particular premise, and the conclusion of an action. Which conclusion follows from or flows out of the preceding rational logical process. Now, if that's the case, then why would somebody come up to these French fries and end up eating them? How exactly does that happen? Well, Aristotle again has said the person who does it, if he's incontinent, is actually exercising his reasoning. So his reasoning is still at work. So he's still doing this practical syllogism reasoning process. But how is it possible for him to do that if when he uses a practical syllogism, the action just follows from that? Well, here's what Aristotle says. Excuse me. He says the incontinent person does not just have one practical syllogism that's at play. There's a competition among the practical syllogisms. There's another or other practical syllogisms that also come into play, and they lead him in a different direction than the first one. So let's look at this going back to our example with the French fries. We saw the first practical syllogism of the fatty foods are bad and should be avoided. This bowl of French fries is fatty food. This bowl of French fries is fatty. Conclusion, avoid it. But there's also another kind of practical syllogism that can come into play. And this one is salty, well-cooked foods are tasty. This bowl of French fries is a salty, well-cooked bunch of food. Oh, no, let me back that up. I'm sorry. The second practical syllogism that can be at play here is the following. Premise one, the universal premise. Salty, well-cooked foods are tasty, should be eaten. This bowl of French fries is a bunch of salty, well-cooked food. And what would the conclusion be here? Eat it. Just eat it. Now, what we see, therefore, is that there can be two different practical syllogisms about the same bowl of food, and these two different practical syllogisms will lead to two very different courses of action. Both of these practical syllogisms are examples of a reasoning process at work. Both of them demonstrate that the person is using his reasoning, his thinking about the situation. However, in the first practical syllogism, what do we see? Well, we see, you might say, a more well thought out, more well reasoned understanding of the situation. In the second one, what we see is that the person's taste buds, if you will, have influenced the reasoning from the start. Now, again, that first premise in the second practical syllogism says, well-cooked, salty food is tasty and should be eaten. Now, what that means is that the person's reasoning has been duly influenced by his appetites, and very much so, because it's saying tasty should be eaten. Those things have been equated and come together in the mind of this incontinent person. So tasty, therefore, becomes something that should be automatically followed. You don't question it. Once you've realized that it's a question of taste, or there's something tasty available, it's there. Okay, let me analyze this a bit more. if you're trying to solve a math equation and you figure out what x is, you just automatically write it down. You don't have to then perform other additional steps. Once it's clear what the answer is and you've reasoned your way to it, you just write down that answer. Now, in that case, it's not necessarily an issue of whether your emotions don't have much to do with solving that. It's just these are the rules of math or the formulas or the equations, and you figured out how to apply that. Once, moreover, once it's clear what x is, then you just write that down. And there's no further questioning or reflection required. Now, in a similar way, what's going on here with the incontinent person is that once it's clear that this thing is tasty and you've reasoned that this is what's going on, then you automatically do it. Just like you would write down the solution, you would go after the tasty thing. Now, the person has reasoned about this, but he's reasoned based on his emotions. Because he said to himself, "Oh, if something's tasty, it's worth doing. It's good to do." Now we can see pretty clearly that that's not, again, a well-reasoned way of thinking, but it is a reasoned way of thinking. I know that's kind of an odd way to describe it, but just bear with me for a second. Go back to the person who's brutish, or you know, who acts kind of like an animal based purely on instinct or something. The lion who's attacking the zebra, who's carrying out those sorts of animal instincts, that lion is not having to reason about a general idea. He doesn't have a universal first premise at play. He doesn't have to say, all striped things are good to eat. This zebra is a striped thing, therefore eat it. That's not what's going on. It's automatic, it's instantaneous, it's a natural drive being carried out, etc. There's not a reasoned process at work in what the lion is doing. The lion is not acting for explicit reasons like we're talking about in this case. The incontinent person, on the other hand, the one who thinks tasty things should be eaten, is reasoning. He's presented himself with a thought or idea, and he's using that to justify what he's doing. He's using that to kind of motivate him toward what he's doing. So what Aristotle is saying is that it's not that the person's rational faculty just goes out the window or has gone haywire, like we saw with the brutish person acting in an animal-like way. It's that the person's reasoning is put into the service, well, as being really strongly influenced by the emotions in such a way as to just justify following your taste buds and beginning to think that that's just a good thing to do. So the person can, for example, tell this to himself. He can articulate this to himself to some extent. He may even be able to articulate it to somebody else. Now, this obviously separates the incontinent person from somebody who doesn't have any reason. Like, no animal reflects to itself and says, "Oh, yeah, that's why I'm going to kill that zebra." It doesn't have can't have a conversation about that. Whereas the incontinent person can have this self dialogue or even dialogue with other people. So let's go back to the practical syllogism we talked about. Premise one: all well-cooked, salty food is tasty and should be eaten. Again, a very strongly emotionally influenced premise. Premise 2, this bowl of French fries is salty, well cooked. You just see that right in front of you. And then you have the first premise, you have the second premise. What's going to follow? Automatically, it flows out of those premises. It follows directly from those premises that you will be led to eat that food because it's tasty and you've reasoned that tasty things should be eaten. Boom, boom, boom. That's the cool thing about logic. Conclusions just follow from the premises. We'll go to that syllogism I talked about earlier, where I said all men are mortal. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. It just automatically follows from that. You don't even have to really figure it out or work your way to the conclusion. All A are B, all B are C, therefore all A are C. Boom. It's an automatic following upon the premises. It comes directly. But if you're talking about a practical syllogism, the conclusion, again, to reiterate, is not an idea, but an action, which means if it follows if it's a conclusion, it follows immediately from the premises, and therefore the action will follow immediately from the premises insofar as the conclusion of a practical syllogism is an action. So the person, according to Aristotle, this incontinent person has used his reason, has let his emotions creep too far into his reasoning. His emotions are becoming too powerful, and they're overly influencing his reasoning. Another way to describe this is that those emotions that are duly influencing him are duly. Let me back this up. We talked earlier about how there are two practical syllogisms that could be at play here. In the first one, the person moves away from the French fries, and the second, he goes toward it. Now, the second one is obviously what the incontinent person does habitually. Now, another way to say this is that the first one is a well-reasoned one in which the rational faculty is operating well. The second one is a not well-reasoned one in which the rational faculty has been kind of overly influenced and controlled even by the emotions. What we see, therefore, is that when the second practical syllogism, when the incontinent practical syllogism wins out over the well-reasoned practical syllogism, in essence, what's going on is that the emotional drive, the appetites win out over well-reasoned thought process. They're winning out over the rational faculty, in other words. They're temporarily taking over. And why do I say temporarily? Well, because the person is still able to think well in most instances of life. He's still a rational agent. He's not like the brutish person. And he's still able to recognize a lot that, being self-indulgent in general is a bad thing, right? He has that understanding in mind. But you put this person in front of the bowl of French fries, and what do we see happen? Well, we see that there's these two competing practical syllogisms, but eventually the second one says tasty things should be eaten, and in which the emotional appetites take over the reasoning, that one wins out. And he ends up doing this action. So the emotionally driven practical syllogism wins out, and this person does a self-indulgent action, which in most circumstances he recognizes as bad. So he has this usual understanding of things. Self-indulgence is not a good thing, he says to himself. He understands that. But you put him in these particular cases, and his taste buds, his emotional life has become habituated to overruling his reason in these cases, and he follows through. He does the action that follows from the practical syllogism, and the action he does is contrary to what he usually knows to be the case. Now, Aristotle has kind of some interesting ways to describe this. That imagine somebody who's inebriated or drunk. The person can still talk philosophy. I've been there myself a couple times. They can still remember all sorts of things. They can sound pretty damn smart. Maybe not as smart as they think they sound, but they actually sound decently smart. But their reasoning is not operating well. It's a inebriated reasoning, if you will, not a proper reasoning. So it's not the well-reasoned process that we saw, for example, with the first practical syllogism. It's an alcohol-influenced rational process. And in the same way, the second practical syllogism that led to the incontinent action is an emotionally influenced reasoning, an overly emotional, one that's influenced too much by the emotion. So, with somebody who thinks, well, he's kind of inebriated, that picking a fight with somebody is a good idea, and he kind of has a thought about it, his state of inebriation or his state of being buzzed is what's influencing his reasoning. It's not that his reasoning has gone totally out the window and he doesn't have it. It's just that it's been temporarily overwhelmed, not necessarily overwhelmed, but for the time being, it's not operating on full cylinders, and that state of inebriation is taking over a lot of it. And that's what's similar to what's going on with the incontinent person. So that's how Aristotle kind of responds to the Socratic Platonic idea, or the idea of ethical determinism. He says, look, no, the incontinent person is actually acting as a rational agent. He has a knowledge of what is good. Again, this person we're talking about, this incontinent person, first of all, he knows usually and for the most part that yes, self-indulgence is bad. And as a matter of fact, he even can say to himself, I don't really want to be self-indulgent. It's not a good thing. I know it's bad. I know it's bad. I know it's not the good thing to do. Okay? But you put him in this circumstances, and what we see is this over influence of his appetites, his taste buds on his reasoning, overwhelming the well-reasoned practical syllogism and leading to the incontinent act. And now let's give some more examples that kind of discuss this. Now, one thing that comes to my mind directly is something like smoking cigarettes. Now, this is not a moral judgment. I'm just saying I've met a number of people who've told me, geez, I wish I could quit. But they go back to it. They'll say stuff like, this is a horrible habit. I don't really want this. I know it's bad for me. This isn't good. Those statements demonstrate a general sense that this is not a good idea. They have a knowledge that this is not good. They've rationally understood a situation, to put it more in Aristotle. But these are also people, and again, this is not not a condemnation. I mean, we all are in these sort of situations. But people who also smoke are often also will buy a number of packs of cigarettes a day. And there's various reasons for it. Various causes that are at play: stress, anxiety, etc. But it's an action performed in direct opposition to what they know to be good. And it's an action they regret. And they're not happy with themselves for having done it. Now, I'll give you a second example of this. It's more about my own. This is more of my own life. Um, it, my first year teaching at Catholic University of America, um, my weekends usually consisted of the following. I would start watching football, college football on Saturday afternoon. I'd watch a fair amount of it. Sunday, around 1 o'clock, I'd start watching football. I'd get done around, I don't know, 11 o'clock at night whenever the Sunday night football game ended. Now, there's a damn lot of football I watched over the weekends. And I'd also end up ordering a lot of Chinese food from this place called Kenny's Sub Shop. My roommates and I were convinced that we kept Kenny's Sub Shop in Wheaton, Maryland, in business in the fall and winter of 2012, 2013, which we may well have. The point being that, after that amount of indulgence of television and unhealthy Chinese food, I never felt really happy with myself. I didn't really feel good about it. I didn't really want to do it, but I just kind of fell into that pattern. It just kind of happened, I would say. I start watching TV, the next thing you know, it's like, oh my God, I've been sitting here for 4 hours. Or it's like, well, I may as well do this. I'm already in this position. I've already been doing it. This is the way I do things. I'm going to end up just ordering the Chinese food again for the 10th time. So this pattern starts to develop. And it's not a pattern that we're really like thrilled about. It's not one that we reflect on and we try to make better. It's not a pattern that is it's something we've deliberated about and chosen because we see it as a step to a higher way of living or a better way of living or a more virtuous way of living. It's a pattern that we kind of let ourselves sink into. There's a comfort to it. And if we kind of did something differently, it'd be a little bit painful at first because we're breaking out of our usual way of doing things. But we're not thrilled about it. And on one level, we know that it's not the best thing for us. I mean, yeah, I kind of knew like this isn't great. I wasn't like super proud of it. And I could begin to recognize that this was an example of incontinence. I even remember bringing it up to my students. But even after I brought it up to my students and had articulated to them the fact that this pattern wasn't a great thing for me to do, I did it again and again. I kind of did it again. So it was obviously becoming habitual for me. I was becoming used to it. I was becoming used to spending my weekends in this rather overly indulgent in TV and eating manner. And this wasn't like super horrible thing, but it wasn't a good thing. And it was a thing, kind of bad thing that I knew to be bad. I didn't really want, but I sunk into it anyway and continued to do it anyway. So it was pretty much, I think, what Aristotle's getting at when he's talking about being incontinent. Now, one of the key points I think to this is that it's almost as if when we're sinking into incontinence, we kind of shut off our full reasoning and willing capacity. And what do I mean by that? Well, I'm going to take something that Augustine talked about because I think it's really helpful here. Augustine talks about how, you know what, we can end up, when you want to wait, you wake up in the morning and there's this like 5 seconds where you have enough energy to just get out of bed. But then there's this other part of you that's like, I just kind of want to lay in bed. I don't want to sit here. I don't want to do that. And if we don't seize the moment in those 5 to 10 seconds, we'll just kind of literally and metaphorically, I would say, lie back down and sort of sink into this half sleeping, half awake state that we know doesn't really make us less tired and doesn't really give us any extra sleep, but we kind of feel comfortable in this sort of weird state of being half awake and half asleep and not operating on full cylinders. So we allow ourselves to stay in this sort of limbo-esque state almost because we think it's more comfortable than having to commit ourselves to getting up and doing something with our day. Because you get out of bed and you have to do something, right? I mean, you're going to be led to do something, even if it's going to the bathroom and brushing your teeth or taking a shower, whatever. So even if you're not like super intentional about your day, you're still going to be active and engaged with the world. And therefore, you're going to have to start taking responsibilities for things. And you're going to have to maybe plan some things out. You have to respond to things and meet certain needs and um, make sure certain deadlines are met or whatever. So you're going to be an engaged, active participant in your life. And you have to, again, as I said, assume responsibility, work at things, put in some effort, etc. And that can be demanding, that can be difficult. You don't know how this is going to go. You don't want to have to face the day, as the expression goes. So what do? Well, we allow ourselves to not have to face the day, but not because we go back to sleep, but because we sort of stay in this weird half sleep, half awake state of not really doing anything, not resting to get ready for the day or to replenish ourselves, and not engaging our responsibilities and work and effort and needs for the day, but kind of in this bizarre in between state. And I think incontinence is kind of something similar. See, we're not really saying to ourselves, I want to be fully bad. I just want to indulge all the time. We're not living a totally hedonistic and base life in that regard. I wasn't going out and doing this every day. I wasn't doing this to total excess. I wasn't committing myself to it and trying to figure out more ways to get more Chinese food or anything like that. So I wasn't doing that. But on the other hand, I wasn't actually engaging other parts of my life. I wasn't trying to think about other good things I could be doing. I wasn't trying to think about new patterns that I could bring about. I wasn't thinking about, okay, maybe I should go and rake the lawn, go for a run, call a friend, um, correct papers, etc. I wasn't using my sole faculties of reason and will to their fullest extent. I wasn't even allowing myself to move in that direction. I think partially because I knew that if I did, I'd have to start being more responsible and it could be demanding and I'd have to put in effort. Again, this is similar to our thought process when we're waking up and we don't want to get out of bed. We don't want to seize the moment because we know it might be rough, it might demand something of us, it might be difficult, etc. So I think in a similar way, like when I was just sort of sinking into this incontinent pattern, what I was doing was wanting to not have to really be responsible and engaged with the world and think about the best kind of actions I could do and try to carry them through and choose different things that would be good for me. I didn't want to have to do that difficult work of my soul, in other words. I didn't want to have to put in the damn effort. I was lazy. So the laziness facilitated the sinking in to the pattern of doing something that I knew I shouldn't do. All right. The laziness created the conditions in which I just fell into that path. And it's harder to get out. Let's go back to the bed analogy. What do people say about uh uh a warm bed, right? A warm bed is easy to get into, but hard to get out of, right? Especially when it's cold in the winter months like we have around here. The same is true with this. A habit of incontinence, easy to sink into, especially if laziness is at play. It's hard to get out from. It's a sinking into it. Another way to describe this is something my friend Ryan talked about, where he said he was reflecting on people getting drunk, and he said, sometimes people get drunk because they're celebrating something good, like at a wedding. Sometimes people just get drunk and then they have a hangover the next day. And in the course of the hangover, they're feeling sick, kind of blah, I don't really want to do anything. And that seems like a really undesirable state. Who would want to have a hangover, right? But Ryan pointed out something I think really illustrating and illuminative here. He said, there is something desirable about it. Well, what's desirable? You don't have to do the difficult soul work of figuring out what you're going to do with your day. You don't have to do the difficult soul work of deciding what's the best course of action in certain situations. You don't have to do the difficult soul work of reflecting on whether you should do A or B or C or D. You don't have to do the difficult soul work of taking responsibility for these things. You don't have to do the difficult soul work of putting yourself on the line and saying, geez, did I live today well? Okay. Why? Because you're like, oh, I can't do it. I'm hungover, man. Like I'm sick. I can't. What? I'm not gonna be able to do that. So I don't have to do that difficult soul work. So I'm excused. You're excusing yourself from engaging your soul in the task of living. And I think something similar is going on when we fall into these patterns of incontinence. I think part of, and this is just a reflection on my own life, but I've seen it with other people too. Part of what's going on is incontinence allows us the opportunity to not do the difficult soul work of fully engaging ourselves in our daily lives, in the tasks, in the demands, in the needs, in the opportunities that constitute our daily lives. So, well, I think another example of this, television is a perfect example of this, right? Vegging out is an expression we use to describe watching an excessive amount of television. Well, let's think about that for a second. Vegging out means I'm just kind of being like a vegetable. I'm just lying there like a vegetable. Well, this is very apt, right? Because Aristotle says, look, the vegetative faculty of the soul is not something that the reasoning can properly direct. It's not something influenced by reasoning or that can adhere to a rational principle of thinking, of reflection, of voluntary action, of deliberation, of choice, of intentional living. So those processes of the rational faculty of the soul then are not at play. You don't have to worry about them. You don't have to put them into practice. You don't have to do that hard work if you're acting like a vegetable, if you're vegging out in front of the TV, especially to excess. This doesn't have to be the TV. This can also be the computer. I can think of myself watching hours of sports videos or something like that, where I'm like, geez, why did I do this? Well, I think short answer, if I'm honest, is this was easy and a desirable option because it meant that I didn't have to really do the difficult soul work of engaging myself with the world around me and having to reflect and take responsibility and see how I've lived my day. Man, it's a hell of a lot easier if I'm just like, oh, just breeze through the day. Good Lord, that was simpler. Holy crap. Glad I didn't have to kind of make that tough decision, or glad I didn't have to, you know, really dig in and persevere, or glad I didn't have to reflect on what I was doing, or geez, I'm glad I didn't have to perform that difficult task of talking to my friend who was in need or something like that. So because being a fully engaged rational agent in the world is hard work. Like it's actually not easy to always have a good reflection on what we're doing. It's not always easy to do the work of deliberating about a proper course of action. It's not always easy to take responsibility for what we've done and run the risk of being blamed if it goes wrong and be liable for this. It's not always easy to properly work on directing our emotions. It's not always easy to realize that there's something good or the noble or the kalan that's worth pursuing, and that damn it, we have to pursue it no matter what else is going on. That's not always easy to do. Now, what Aristotle's getting at is eventually the virtuous person, it becomes easier to do. But in the path to virtue, holy crap, that is hard and it's demanding. And you don't always want to do it. And you don't always want to run the risk of failure. And it can be lonely and stuff like that. And that's where incontinence comes in so often, I think, is to say, screw it, man. I'm not gonna have to. I don't want to do it. I'm just gonna sit here. I'm gonna veg out. I'm just gonna eat this. It's like I'm tired of having to put in the effort. I want to be lazy. And there's a weird kind of temptation that goes on, and it's so strange. The temptation goes, I think, something like this. It's saying, man, if I could just be lazy, it'd be so much easier, and I would feel so much better. And that's the trap, right? I mean, that's crap. We know that if we give in, we're not going to actually feel better. We end up feeling worse. But it's an alluring trap for us because it tempts us away from the thing we know is going to be demanding, difficult, and a lot of work. So we're not fully committed to that work. So if something comes along and say, hey, this is going to feel a lot better, we're like, fine, I'm in. This is going to be great, man. So we think, oh, it'd be great just to veg out and watch these Netflix for or watch these videos or eat this food, or man, it'd be great just to drink a couple more beers. I feel so much better. Do we? No, we don't. Now, there's a temporary way in which we do, and it does work, right? To at least initially, it does work because it makes us a little bit more relaxed, and we're like, oh, fine, I don't have to put that effort in it. But because we are still rational agents, because we're still reflective agents, because we're still people trying to be ethical to some extent, that temporary pleasure is just that. It's temporary, and we know it doesn't last. And it's soon, very soon, I would say, replaced by a sense of shame or guilt or regret over what we've done. But here's the rub, and kind of the problem is that the sense of guilt or shame or regret means that we may have to reinitiate that process of the full engagement and the hard work, which our laziness doesn't want us to do. Part of us doesn't want us to do. So we're led back to the same behavior that made us feel shameful in the first place. And how do we get away from that shame? Well, we kind of go back to that behavior. So that's why this notion of a vicious cycle can come in. In other words, you kind of fall into a pattern, you're not really happy with it, you feel ashamed about it, but you don't want to put in the work of getting out of it. And the shame makes you feel even kind of worse. So you don't want to feel that bad. So you do something to make yourself feel less bad, less ashamed. And what do? You end up doing the same thing that made you feel ashamed in the first place. So it's a feedback loop, or it's a vicious cycle. Do the action, makes you feel bad. And how do you make yourself feel less bad? Do that same action. So you end up back in the same place and keep doing it over and over again. The Buddhist expression I thought is really helpful in this. Is they call it, you're going through the round. You're going around and around. You never get anywhere. Well, you do, right? You don't get anywhere going up. You don't get anywhere going out. You get somewhere going down. You sink into it. So that again refers to what I was talking about earlier, falling into the pattern and being unable to break away from it. Now, the final thing I want to talk about here is how this vicious cycle, this pattern, this habituation, this being stuck, it should remind us, I think, of addiction. Now, I want to be clear. I think that what Aristotle was saying sometimes about incontinence and what we understand about addiction don't always line up. For example, the notion of a cure. Addiction is not always curable in the way I think Aristotle was describing it. However, I think there's a lot of overlap between incontinence and addiction. I used to work at a rehabilitation clinic for people who were suffering from addictions to opioids, such as heroin, oxycontin, fentanyl, etc. And some people were very committed to sobriety, and they had some sense of wanting to get better. They would not be going back and back and back and every day to a drug rehab clinic if on some level they didn't know this was good and they kind of wanted to do it. But they would slip up, and it was really difficult to break that pattern. And there was a dependency on the substance here, and I needed a lot of help to do it. Or we can think about Alcoholics Anonymous. One of the first steps is to say that people's lives had become unmanageable and they had to turn it over to a higher power. What I think we see with this is that the incontinent pattern and the habituated incontinent patterns can become really destructive, and they can really become the sort of thing that traps us in a deep way, that makes us very, very stuck. And it's not easily cured at all. But at the same time, there's this paradox because we kind of want to get out and we want to be healthy, and we at least don't want to do that thing because we know that it's bad. And we think there's got to be something better, but we're not always sure the way out. So when you think about incontinence, what I talked about earlier was just the example of somebody eating the bowl of French fries, because that was a clear example, and we were talking about the practical syllogism. What I want to say now is that, yeah, that's very true of Aristotle. I think it's a very clear example. I think it helps show how our reasoning becomes overly influenced by our emotions. But that's just one instance. What we're seeing now is that the one instance can become a second instance, can become a third and a fourth. And eventually, what happens? It becomes a habit. And if we talked about earlier in this class, a habit is a deeply, deeply ingrained part of who we become. It becomes a second nature to us. It becomes something that we just automatically do. It becomes our normal way of being. So the thought process, the emotionally influenced thought process that leads to those actions. Eventually, those actions just become second nature, and you just do them. And that's what I was talking about earlier with the example of somebody who's habitually smoking. My own example of just eating the Chinese food or self-indulging with the TV watching or the video watching or the drinking the alcohol. That just becomes something that we're doing without really reflecting on it at all. Like any other habit, it becomes so ingrained and so part of the way we live our lives. So incontinence starts out as an action based on a practical syllogism in which our reasoning is at play, but eventually it becomes a deeply ingrained habit for us. Now, we will still, says Aristotle, I think he's right in this, we're still going to recognize this isn't right unless we become totally warped and totally obsessed with being bad. We're still going to say, no, this isn't right. And we're still on some level, I think, gonna want something different because we recognize this isn't good. But I'll use that analogy I said earlier. If you're sinking in, you're falling into a sinkhole. The further down you get, it's very obvious that the more difficult it is to extract yourself from that, or to even have other people help you be extracted from it, to be lifted out of it, to be removed from it. And so the incontinent patterns that develop, this is actually like a serious issue. Um, and this is kind of the way I want to close this, is to say we live in a society where in some sense incontinence is, it's not even just like it's not taken seriously. In some sense it's encouraged, like binge watching or vegging out or just kind of whatever in that regard. Like, well, there's a serious element to that because if that becomes habitual and patterned, it becomes like an addiction. Is as I was saying earlier, addiction, full on addiction becomes the sort of thing where somebody's life becomes quote unmanageable. That's pretty freaking serious. That's not just a joke. Now, I'm not trying to say that like the addiction that the binge watching leads to like heroin addiction. No, that's not what I'm saying. What I am saying though is that human life is malleable. It's flexible. So it starts out as something small, can cascade into something big. And that's why it's important just to kind of have that sense of seriousness about it. And getting back to what I was saying earlier, be willing to engage the difficult task of soul work, reflection, thoughtfulness, decision, taking responsibility, etc. That is the sort of work that we have to engage with, or else we run the risk, I think, of letting ourselves fall into actions that become patterns, that become habits, that become possibly an unbreakable habit and therefore an addiction. So it, there's a lot at play here. And this, I think, is one of the great things what Aristotle is saying. Like, look, being human is a task. It's something that we have to work at. And the work can be demanding. But because it's a task, it's never set. And so what is simultaneously the demand is also the cause for hope, right? The demand is that we have to keep doing it. It's difficult and we can fail and we have to take responsibility. But the hope is it's not a finished state. So if the pattern is starting to develop, it's possible to kind of go in the other way. It's possible to say, no, I'm not going to just sink into laziness today. I'm going to try something different. I'm going to evoke a different pattern here. And maybe it's a baby step. Maybe it's something small. Maybe it's, you know what? I'm just going to go for a walk. I'm not going to watch TV. Small victory. It's a small step toward not letting the laziness and the pattern take over and allowing ourselves to re-exercise our full agency and re-engage in a more healthy and soulful way with the world around us. And just as a pattern can sink in easily in one way, it can also be built up. that's again the reason for the hope. It's the cause for saying it's a lot of work. It's also the cause for saying there's reason for hope. So that's kind of want to leave you with this notion that when we act in an incontinent way, we're not being vicious, we're not being brutish, it's not an animal instinct thing. There is knowledge and reasoning at work. What we saw with the example of the French fries is that this reasoning becomes overly influenced by our emotions, by our appetites. The next thing we saw is that the actions of an incontinent nature can become patterns, become habits. We can sink into it in a large part because of a laziness and because we don't want to have to do the difficult work of being human. And the final thing is, though, is that we always have that option of doing that work, and we can make certain steps, baby steps, that become infant steps, that become young child steps, that eventually become adult steps, and the path is reoriented away from the incontinence and toward the